There we go. We're recording live. Our first interactive SDK webinar for Flywheel. So we will get started here. Caleb Fisher and Maggie Mahan are our two scientific solutions engineers here at Flywheel. Caleb has been with us for a while now, and many of you advanced developer users are probably have already interacted with him before. Maggie joined us earlier this year, and has been helping a lot of people along on our scientific solutions team as well. We have a host of others that I know are watching as well today. And myself, I'm Jeff Yeager. I know many of you as I'm looking at the attendee list here already, but I do see quite a few that I have not met yet. So that is a really good sign that we are growing for our user base. And that's exactly what we want to see is get you guys not just using Flywheel, but getting the most out of Flywheel that you can. And that's the idea here today is turn everybody here into power users. With that, I will turn it over to Caleb and we can start today's webinar.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. So just as kind of an overview of what we're going to cover today, this is a very bare bones basic introduction to using the SDK. Our goal is to demonstrate how you can look up containers and files that already exist in Flywheel. And then we'll do a little bit of a demo of the advanced search UI. The part 2 that follows this will look at more advanced methods of finding things in Flywheel, like using finders or some more detail on using the advanced search feature. In order to follow along today, you will need read access to a Flywheel project that contains a file, ideally. Since we're not doing any updating of any containers or files, all you need to do is read. None of the code in this notebook will actually edit your Flywheel data in any way, so it's totally safe to run. You'll need access to an API key. We'll show you how to retrieve that if you're not sure, and an environment to use the notebook in. If you have Jupyter Lab or Jupyter, you can do that, but we've provided a Colab link, which is pretty snappy for getting up and going. You'll probably have a message that says you need to either open this in playground mode or copy it to your Google Drive in order to execute, because we just have a read-only notebook that we've shared. This is a pretty good practice for generally sharing Colab notebooks because they do occasionally save the outputs. And since your client contains your API key, you don't really want to share all of the outputs. With any notebook, we start by installing and importing dependencies. Basically anything on pip can be installed with this command in a notebook, preceded by an exclamation point and then pip install like you do from a terminal. To run in Colab, you just press this nifty little run button. And your output will look a little bit different since I've already installed it on this particular Colab notebook. Import statements allow us to actually use the packages that we've imported. I've imported some basic like OS and logging that are pretty much used anytime I'm using a notebook. Re is for regular expression usage. Pprint for formatting stuff. This git pass is very nice for allowing you to input credentials without actually showing what the values are on screen. And then we've got some IPython display options for rendering things nicely in a notebook. And of course, the Flywheel SDK. We run these cells. I've already run them, so I won't run them again. you instantiate a logger just as a code convention. You can use print for things like this if you want. In a notebook, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but in Gears, it's something to keep in mind. So to initialize a Flywheel client, which is what you're going to need to do anytime you use the Flywheel SDK, you're going to need access you're going to need an API key. To find your API key, you'll click on this little circle that's in the upper right-hand corner of your Flywheel instance and click on Profile. I'm not going to go there because then I'll show everyone my API key. But when you scroll down on that profile page, you'll see this box that says API key. If there's nothing in this box yet, you can click Revoke and generate a new API key. Or the button might say something slightly different for you, but there's a button under the box that will generate your API key. And you can come back to this page anytime you need to regenerate it. If you copy what's in this box, we'll hang on to that so we can paste it later. Technically, you can initialize your client with Flywheel client and then your API key, but in any code you're sharing, you don't want to do it this way. You either want to store your API key as an environment variable or in a text file you're parsing that isn't shared in any repository, or you want to use this git pass method to copy and paste your API key. I can't overstate this. You never want to share your API key with anyone for any reason, not your PI, not Flywheel, not a postdoc, nobody, because it's the same as sharing your password. And if there's any PHI on your Flywheel instance, it's a HIPAA violation. So just don't do it. If it happens by accident, you can regenerate, but really try not to share your API key with anybody. So when you run this book or this code here, you're going to get a little enter your API key here and a box. You're going to paste the API key that you copied from your profile page in here and hit enter. And it should print. You're now logged in as whatever your email address is at the address to your instance. The most straightforward way to retrieve a container or file in Flywheel, just as an aside, a container is anything in the Flywheel hierarchy that stores files like a project, subject, session, acquisition. The way that we use the lookup requires like a file path like string, which we call the resolver path, which is basically going to be the group ID followed by the container label down the hierarchy to your file or to the container of interest. If you wanted more information on the Flywheel hierarchy, we've provided a link here. In order to generate a basic resolver path, you do need to start with the group ID. It's worth distinguishing between the group ID and the group label. The group ID is going to appear here at the top of your project page in Flywheel. This is the group label, but you want the group ID. This path here is actually the path, resolver path to your project. So in the above image, group ID is going to be Cyan, group label is Scientific Solutions, and the project label is Midas Veggies. And if we were going to do lookup for this project, we do FW lookup Cyan / Midas Veggies, and that would return the project. To find your other container labels, subject label can be found either in this sessions view box under the subject column. Session labels can be found in the session column, respectively. The session label can also be found in this bold portion of your acquisitions tab. Acquisition label is going to be the bolded label at the top of your acquisition, and then this is where you'd find a file name. So if we were to retrieve a subject, specifically this dragon fruit subject, we'd grab the resolver path to the project, then this subject label. If we wanted to look at the session, then we'd add the session label to the resolver path of the subject. And files are slightly different. You do need to add a files portion to your path in between the container in which they're located, the path to the container in which they're located, and the name of the file. So in order to look up this IM0001, I'd want to do cyan, Midas veggies, dragon fruit, session1, ac1, files, and then IM_0001. You can look up files at any level of the Flywheel hierarchy. This isn't limited to acquisition files. You just need to include this files portion to specifically look at a file rather than a container. So we're gonna prep for actually running this code on an actual project and actual containers in Flywheel. I've defined a nice little function that shows a few best practices. One is that it's got a doc string that lists out the arguments and what the function returns, logs some information. We have a try and except here because it's possible for you to put in an invalid resolver path. So we want to handle that rather than just allowing it to raise without any sort of handling. So that's a function that we'll be using for the code examples below. Basically what it does is it attempts to look up the resolver path. If it's not valid, it'll print a nice little statement with the traceback. Otherwise, it will print out a string of the label of your project is a acquisition session subject, whatever it is, with an ID and then the ID of your container, which we'll touch on a little bit more when we get to using get methods. So here we're going to substitute the labels that are in this code cell with those that are pertinent to your actual project. I'm going to navigate to your project, click on the subject tab or sessions tab. And then I actually, instead of the dragon fruit here, I'm going to get tomato. Go ahead and fill this in with whatever the appropriate ID, group ID and labels are for your actual Flywheel data. And nothing will output when you run this code. It'll just store them. But then when you look up the group, it'll tell you what the resolver path, which is just going to be this cyan, or whatever your group ID is. And next code cell will look up your project, subject, session, acquisition, and file. And just to test out the exception handling feature of the function that we defined, we're going to run, we're going to provide this group does not exist resolver path. And it tells us an exception was raised when we tried to look at this container. which is basically 404, it's not found because nothing exists at the resolver path we provided. So let's take a couple minutes here for any questions or comments.
I don't think there's any questions we haven't been able to answer in the chat. One question that did come up is whether or not the Flywheel.client is the preferred way of accessing data, if not Flywheel.flywheel.
So Flywheel.flywheel has been deprecated.
Yep.
So you'll want to use Flywheel.client.
Yep. I think that was the answer we gave. So one more question came in about the speed differences between FW get and FW lookup.
Oh yeah, we're going to go over that in just a minute here.
Perfect. So that was a good way to lead
it's
us
a
into.
Great segue.
Yes. We did not even pay anybody to see these questions. This is great. Yeah, continue to throw some questions in the chat. We'll answer them, or we'll take pit stops occasionally. So thanks for the participation. Caleb, I'll let you get back to it.
Awesome. So there are a couple of limitations of lookup. It has the advantage of being simple to understand and easy to construct without actually memorizing like an ID or having to navigate to your Flywheel instance. But there are some advantages of get methods, which are one, that there's a speed advantage to using get over lookup when your instance is of sufficiently large size. You might not, depending on your instance, you might not notice much of a difference, but for locations like UPenn, this will matter. So you'll want to use get if you're in a position where you can use ID rather than lookup. So if you're actually doing cron jobs via script, you'll want to use get methods. Another limitation of lookup is that if your resolver path is ambiguous, it will return an arbitrary container, especially, so like what I mean by this is that if you have duplicate sessions with the same label or duplicate acquisitions with the same label, it will just choose one of them when you give the resolver path. So you'll need to use get to actually be specific about what you're trying to retrieve. So in order to use get, we actually need to know where to find the container IDs in Flywheel. The project ID and session ID are the easiest to obtain. In the sessions tab on a project, your project ID will actually be adjacent to this projects portion. So you can just copy it from right here for project ID. Sessions ID, it follows sessions. We've got a photo for reference here. So if I wanted to look up this particular project, the command would be fw get that ID. If there are also container specific methods of get, like in this case, get project, these will also have a speed advantage on large instances, and because you don't have to, our backend doesn't have to take additional time to figure out what kind of container it's trying to retrieve. We're telling it straight up that you need to get the project with this ID. I would recommend doing this in most cases. A reason you might use get would just the straight up get method is one, you just don't have time for typing out get project. The other would be that your code doesn't know what the container type is at the time of execution. So one of the examples for this that I think is the most common is when you're running an analysis gear and you're trying to look at what the destination for that gear is. You might not necessarily know that it's a project or a session or a subject. Subject ID, you can also get from a URL, but first you have to enter subject view. So in order to enter subject view, we click on this little person icon under these tabs. but we can see we still don't have a subject's URL. So we actually have to click on the subject. And you'll notice your URL has changed. Instead of listing sessions, it has subjects. And this would be the subject ID. Acquisition ID is a little trickier to find. It's true that you could iterate over the child containers and grab the ID attribute of the acquisitions under a session. But one of the cases in which you want to grab the ID directly from the UI would be you notice something weird in the UI and you want to troubleshoot, but you don't want to have to write code to iterate over things. Like, it's extra code, it's extra work. So I'm going to demonstrate how to find the acquisition ID in Chrome, which is the recommended browser for using Flywheel. You have to open up an inspector window, and you open that up by clicking, doing a right click and inspect. And that'll bring up this inspection utility here on the side. So I'll magnify my window here. Let's go to, let's actually close this and navigate to an actual acquisition. So click on the acquisitions tab first before inspector. When we inspect, we want to look at the network information because we're actually trying to look at the request that's being made when we pull up the acquisition info, since it'll contain the ID. So we click on the kebab next to the acquisition label title here, or header. Click information, and these two lines of pip appeared in the network tab. We want the one that looks like an alphanumeric string. And then this is going to be the container ID for that acquisition. So we'll copy that guy. And then we'll move back to Flywheel, the SDK that we've got here in our notebook. Getting files rather than containers is slightly different. You first have to get the parent container, and then you will use this. You'll set your parent container to a variable. So here I'm using acc to store the result of get acquisition with the acquisition ID I got from the network tab. And then on this acc variable, I have a method available called getFile. I just provide it with a file name to get the file object itself. So I'll go over the network path to finding the acquisition ID once more. We're going to hit it, inspect, go to network, click on the kebab menu, and then information. And this alphanumeric string, if you click on it and then copy the quoted item next to ID, this is going to be your acquisition ID. There are a couple extra tips with working with Flywheel SDK for the first time. One is that you can use the dir function in Python. This is just native Python, dir. When you provide a variable as input, it will list the attributes of that input. And you can use print to print those. In notebooks, you can also follow a function or method by a question mark. In other IDEs, you'll have to use dot, dunder dot. It's doing the same thing. Notebooks just format it a little nicer for reading, but it will tell you, it'll basically print the doc string, show what the parameters are for the function, and if any examples are listed in the doc string, you'll be able to refer to those. So we're going to actually run code on our real Flywheel objects now. So in the boxes below, you'll want to replace the container IDs with your actual container IDs. So I'm going to close this network tab here. And I want tomato instead. So it obtained my container. Acquisition, Act1 is an acquisition with ID, same ID that I input. And I want to see what attributes are available on my acquisition. So I'm going to run this next code cell. We've got a whole lot. Got add analysis, add notes, get file zip info, info ID. A whole lot of attributes here. I'll close this output so I can do this. One way, so if I wanted to use this toDict method that I found via dir, I could print out the container JSON. And this shows us basically all of the child file information in addition to the attributes of the acquisitions. So it gets a little messy there. All right, pit stop for questions and comments.
Yeah, I think we've got a couple of questions, Caleb. And to all of the attendees, if you are posting questions, it can be helpful if you change in the chat to say all panelists and attendees so that other attendees can actually see the question that's being asked. So Caleb, what do we got here? Can you use wildcards in the different get methods?
Wildcards, no, you do have to use the literal string.
All right, and then can you get a .metadata.json using a .getFile method?
No, .metadata.json is actually going to be something specific to gears that you use to write the metadata of your output. You can get the metadata of a file with a get method. If you do a get to set your acquisition to the result of get acquisition, whatever the container ID is, then when you look at the get file, the file info will be there. Since we're getting this indirectly, next week we'll go over, or next webinar, we'll go over an actual caveat here with loading the file info, specifically when we're looking at the results of Finder or iterating over the children of a container. You have to reload it to fully populate the info, but when you're getting the parent container of a file directly, you just need to get file, then the file name.
I think we've got another question here. Are there similar lookup and get methods for collections?
So I'm pretty sure we've got a get collection method. Let's get a scratch cell here. Yep. So the get collection is going to take the collection ID as input. I don't think I have any collections on this Flywheel instance to demonstrate.
We can always circle back at the end if there's more questions on the collections part and cover grabbing those. Any other questions on what Caleb has covered thus far? All right, I think Caleb, take it to the next section.
All right. So we're actually going to do a little exercise here that's going to take your IDs and generate a URL. This can be especially helpful in notebooks that you're sharing. For example, you've got data that you want your PI to take a look at, but you want to be able to link them so they can actually pull it up in Flywheel. You'd want to provide a link in your notebook. We have a couple helper functions here that help get the instance URL from your client and then format the container link. So I'll run that so that the functions are defined. And then we do fw get project on a project ID. Project link is going to be the result of the create container link and providing the project object as input. And then we have this function to display link, where basically it just given a link address and a link description, it formats HTML for display that will show the link description as text and take you to the link. So that's what that looks like. And I can open that link in a new tab. And it brings me to that projects page. Similarly with subject. Now we're on subject view. And the same thing with session. For whatever reason, left clicking on the link seems to break in Colab. So you'll want to right click and then open in a new tab. Any questions on these parts?
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, Caleb.
Alrighty. So take some time to go over this nifty feature called Advanced Search. Advanced Search streamlines looking up files or containers based on different levels of the Flywheel hierarchy and attributes. If you don't click the link that's going to be found in the code cells below, if you're on your Flywheel instance, you can actually go to enter, just click on the search box and hit enter. And then you'll want to click on this advanced search option on this left sidebar. There are a couple cool features for using advanced search. Suppose I wanted to find DICOM files. I'd look at file.type, and that's auto-completed for me. Nice little Elasticsearch feature there. I have a few options for what I want to do as a comparison. We have the is not, contains, does not contain, and exists. Exists is a little bit unique in that rather than a value, it tells you true or false. False would be to say that file type does not exist. So we could use contains DICO if we only had a partial string we were looking for file type. but I'll actually go for the literal is. And we get this autocomplete on the values, which is pretty nice. We can look at multiple levels of the Flywheel hierarchy. So I could look for subject attributes. In this case, I'll look at subject label. And we'll do contains dragon. We can actually add additional term groups for more complexity. So I'm going to say or, because I want to look for something that's an alternative to this term group. If I click add term group, I get a new box here. I want to say file type is nifty. Subject label is tomato. And maybe I also want to look for dicoms. So if I do or, do nifties or dicoms. There are a couple of options here. Saving the query allows you to apply a label. So that you can come back to that and run it again at some later date. Reset query will clear this box. Running query will actually run the query. You don't have to use this tooling around formatting your query, but it helps remove some of the error from it. Plus, if you enter it by hand, you actually have to switch back to visual mode and start from scratch if you wanted to actually use this later. If we run the query, we get results, and we can look at different container levels for results. Sessions, acquisitions. If we click on one of the rows there, it'll actually populate like a view that you'd see in the sessions view of a project. Acquisitions shows us pretty much the same view. But then with files, you can actually pull up the viewer. You can also look at pertinent analyses. If you're a site admin, at the bottom of this left sidebar, you can actually click View All Data, which will bring up everything that matches your criteria that you don't have explicit permission on. So suppose we wanted to take this query and actually do something with the SDK. I'd copy what's in this box. This code cell here is just taking you to your advanced search page. If you didn't already not follow along with me, you can do a right click and open a new tab to get there. Once you have a query, you can actually replace this query variable with the query that you just formatted. You can also change the return type to acquisition, session, file, or analysis. And then the formatting of this is a little bit different than other Flywheel methods or functions in that it actually wants you to provide some JSON-like input for your search query. Return type is going to specify what kind of containers it's going to return for the results. acquisition, session, file, or analysis are currently the options for advanced search. And structured query is the same query text that you'd find in the UI box as you're constructing a query. You can also provide limit and all data options. So say I'm an admin. The way I'd say all data would be to add this additional value to the dictionary of all data set to true. And it gives me these abbreviated container objects. The way I'd actually get one of these acquisitions would be to take the ID under the acquisition key of this dictionary. So if we wanted to do scratch here, I'm going to create a new variable of results, set it equal to that query. And then I want the first result. And then I want acquisition. Oops. Invalid attribute. It's odd. All right, it expects ID to be underscore. Okay. So then I could do an FW get acquisition. To actually return the acquisition that I got out of a result. All right, so now we'll take time to go over additional questions and comments. And the next webinar in this series will go over how to use finders, how to use advanced search a bit more in depth, and some suggestions for optimizing your code. Let's see.
All right. Let's see. Maggie, do we have any more questions that we didn't answer? I know there was one about, we even logged a feature request during the here, so that was great. So thank you, Caleb, for that. I'm going to post something in the chat here. If anybody has any questions, we can hang on. This is a tutorial where you're going to find this webinar information, the links that we're sending out, and other tutorial, and I want to make sure I'm sharing the right one. Yeah, there it is. But this is a GitLab repository where we're hosting SDK tutorials, including this one in the webinar materials. You're going to find some examples of SDK code here that we are bringing together from our solutions team. And if anybody has any code that they would like to share, that maybe some code that you run quite a bit that you find helpful, we'd love to include it here in this tutorials section. But you may want to browse here for other ones. We'll be posting other future webinar material here. So for those of you that are diving into the SDK, this would be a really good resource to keep an eye on, as we are constantly going to be adding more and more to this repository. Yeah. And I think, yeah, so the next one we're going to have, I think, is the webinar going to be around finders and more advanced search. I think, I'm not sure we have a date for that yet, but if you're on this list, we will send out a notice when that gets put. We'd love to hear feedback from you guys on whether or not this webinar style is useful and helpful for you. And if you have any suggestions on future webinar topics, that would be really great to hear what you guys are interested in, because I think that is, we can talk all day about the nuances of Flywheel, but if no one's interested, I think that then it's not helpful. But I think from the participation today, I think everybody found it very helpful. Seeing some really good comments here. So I'm glad everybody had a good time. Any further thoughts, Maggie, Caleb?
No, just thanks for taking the time to come to the webinar, and be sure to let us know if there are any suggestions for improvements. Also, if there are any features of this webinar that you specifically liked. It's good to constantly be improving the content we're providing.
All right. Well, with that, I think we will conclude today's webinar. Again, you'll get a link for the recording. We'll post it on our docs.flywheel.io website as well within the next day or so. So look for that. And if you haven't already, there is a email list that goes on, and that you'll be notified to your email about new webinars. So actually, we can hang out for a little bit as you think of questions. So I think I do see one more question coming in about how to run gears. Yeah, so we're gonna that is a great one that we can. I think there actually is one of the if it's not posted yet, one of the tutorials in that SDK GitLab repository will be about how to run gears via the SDK. So that would be a really good one to show at a future webinar, I think. So yeah, thanks for that suggestion. Yeah, I'm hearing a lot of good feedback about having the side-by-side of the code versus the Flywheel UI. So I think that's very helpful for me too, seeing that. There's a question from Phil here about using Git rather than Lookup for speed in cron job. Maybe, Caleb, you want to talk about more a little about that?
Yeah, so when you're using Lookup, there's a lot of additional like backend overhead for trying to find the resolver path and validate that it's actually a resolver path. By providing the ID, you're actually providing an ID that represents the document in our database. So you're basically saying exactly what you want to get. It's kind of like providing like I'd say GPS coordinates versus a street address. And for very small instances, lookup is going to be about as performant as Git. It will have the disadvantage that if you have multiple sessions with the same label or acquisitions with the same label, it doesn't know how to disambiguate those two. So that would be a case in which you'd either have to iterate over the children, which we'll demonstrate in the next webinar, or you would have to provide the ID to Git instead.
Jeff, do you see that question? There's a
yes. I'm actually trying to. I thought there was a link, but I will see if I can't get a link to update your preference and subscribe to the list here. See if I can get a link. There you go. Yep, I will post the link here to everyone. If you want to get yourself added to our mailing list for all types of new, we have case studies and newsletters that go out. But if you are just interested in new product trainings, that would be the one you'd want to register for here. And there's going to be a lot of, that way you get notified directly of this. Some of you probably saw that we are advertising these in the app when you log in. That'd be great. We'll continue to use that because I think that was a very effective way of reaching you guys. So I think we'll continue to do that. But yes, please sign up for the email list.
So for the question on general purpose Flywheel tasks, having notebooks or scripts for that, we do have a couple of efforts underway to make things easier, both for gear development and to provide the notebooks. We already mentioned it, but to clarify, I think we provided a link to the Flywheel tutorials that will contain notebooks for common SDK functionality. We're continuously reviewing and adding code to that repository over time. I think currently we have a notebook for the that's a companion to our technical documentation that has code you can actually run for all of those examples. We're adding batch scheduling jobs pretty quickly here. And then there's also the notebook for this webinar there and a couple of other useful ones.
So apparently that link did not work. So I will send out another link once I talk with our marketing team about what's the right link to send out. So we'll get you guys a list, or get you guys on our webinar list one way or another.
I think I just took off the equals sign at the end, and
Is that it?
For
okay.
me.
Okay. So yeah, maybe it's
try that out.
Okay. Oh, there we go. Doubled it up.
Oh.
All right. Tanash is asking if there's pull requests. Have we ever answered that? I assume yes. Yeah. We always appreciate those.
Yeah, I think part of that question maybe was if Flywheel users can also submit to this Flywheel tutorials Jupyter Notebook to be able to contribute their SDK scripts for other people to review, look at, that sort of thing. And the answer is yes.
Okay. Yep, and we will have more of these webinars and forums coming up. I think there was a question about, are we going to have some more of these in the future? Yes, absolutely. We'll have more of these, including some of the webinars that are be more around feature releases when we have features or new product releases. We have bigger update coming very soon around roles and permissions. That is going to be a big change to how we can be more granular about how we give permissions to certain functions in Flywheel. So look forward to that. Oh, the URL mission still didn't work. So like I said, I'll make sure we get a email list sent out. We'll probably just anybody that signed up for this webinar, we'll add to our list, and you guys can, if you don't want to be, you can always opt out after that. So we'll get you guys added one way or another. So, all right. Well, we got 1 minute before the 2 o'clock hour here. Want to respect everybody's time, but really good discussion today. So this was great. If you have, I can hang on for a couple more minutes to collect any questions, and if we can't answer them, we are sure as always to, you can always submit to support at Flywheel to answer questions. One of our tech support team members can often answer them, or if not, they often end up with Maggie, Caleb, or I soon after that. So please always feel free to submit questions to support at Flywheel. So, all right. All right.